My Apple Podcast, your personal connection to everything Apple. Hey everyone, Tim Brown. Welcome back to My Apple Podcast, your personal connection to everything Apple. Today, I want to focus on the podcast app by Apple, and there's good reason for doing so. According to a variety of sources lately, podcasts are experiencing a resurgence. More people are beginning to appreciate the value of this unique medium. This is largely due, in my opinion, to the success of the iPhone, which has helped to increase accessibility for podcasts. So what are podcasts anyway? Podcasts are audio and video recordings attached to a web feed that people can subscribe to. Sources like iTunes function as a portal or aggregator for finding podcasts and subscribing to them. And guess what? They're free. The podcast app is a purple icon with the familiar broadcasting symbol on the front. When you open the app, you will find a menu of options along the bottom. Let's start with the Featured tab. Here, you can browse through featured podcasts by swiping across with your finger or scrolling up and down. If you want to discover the more popular podcasts, select Top Charts on the bottom menu. When you find a podcast you like, tap on your selection. You will then come to a page that provides a description of the podcast, reviews, and a tab for related podcasts. When you find something you like, click subscribe. If you want to find a specific podcast that is not available in the featured or top charts sections, use the search tab on the bottom menu. Your search results will appear as podcasts or podcast episodes. Each recording is called an episode because they are typically offered as part of a sequence. On average, podcasters will update their podcast feed on a daily, weekly, or bi-weekly basis. If you want to locate the podcast you have subscribed to, select the tab My Podcast on the bottom menu. Here you will find a list of your subscriptions. The Unplayed tab on the far left will display all unplayed episodes associated with your subscriptions. Now let's explore the My Podcast section in more detail. When you select a podcast, you will find two tabs, one for unplayed episodes and one for the feed. The Unplayed tab will display the most recent episode. The feed will list all the episodes associated with that podcast. Now let's explore the Playback Controls. To play an episode, select the area that comprises the title and the description. The podcast will play as an audio or video recording. If you select the video podcast, a video will begin to play in the top half of your screen with the title and playback controls on the bottom. To the left and right of the play button, you will find two buttons for fast forwarding or rewinding the recording and 15-second intervals. The 1X to the far left can be selected to change the pace of the recording to a half, 1.5, or twice the speed level. The menu icon on the far right will let you see what is currently playing and what is scheduled to play next. At the very bottom are three more options. At the bottom left is the familiar share icon that allows you to share the podcast as an email, text message, or to social media. The moon icon in the middle provides a list of options for adding a timer to your listening experience that ranges from 5 minutes to 1 hour. When the timer ends, the podcast will stop. The three dots at the far right will bring up a pop-up menu that presents the following options: play next, add to up next, download episode, or alternatively, remove download, mark as unplayed, save episode, view full description, and share episode. I will discuss this menu in more detail when I cover ways to manage podcasts. Finally, continuing with the playback controls is a scroll bar for controlling the volume level, and adjacent to that, an AirPlay icon for mirroring your podcast on an Apple TV. The playback interface for audio podcasts has a slightly different appearance. When you select an audio podcast, the audio will begin to play, and you will have two options as a visual reference. The first option will be the minimized version, which will display the podcast as a banner along the bottom of the screen with the title and episode information. When you tap on the banner, the audio podcast will launch full screen, displaying the podcast artwork above and the playback controls below. Tap once on the artwork to reveal the episode description, and then tap again to return to the artwork. And as I promised, I would like to cover some ways to manage your feeds. There are steps that you can take to make your podcast listening experience more manageable and enjoyable. Let's revisit the drop-down menu that appears when the three dots are selected. The three-dotted icon can be found at the bottom right when the podcast is minimized or launched full screen. It can also be found next to each podcast listing under the Feed tab. Play Next lets you select an episode from any podcast and schedule it to play immediately after the current episode. If you change your mind and select another podcast to play, you will receive a pop-up message that gives you the option to keep Up Next or clear Up Next. The other option, Add to Up Next, allows you to add additional episodes to the Up Next listing. Next is Download Episode. With this option, you can download an episode for offline listening. This option does not require Wi-Fi or the use of cellular network. The files are stored locally on your device. After you've downloaded an episode, you also have an option to remove the download when selecting the three-dotted icon. Mark as Unplayed will display a tiny full circle in light blue just to the left of the podcast title. The circle will disappear when the podcast is completed or appear as a half moon when partially completed. Save Episode is a feature that is similar to download but serves a slightly different purpose. Like the download option, the file will download for offline viewing, yet this option will also add it to a special Saved tab, which will appear as a third option on the menu bar. You will also notice that a tiny iPhone icon will appear to the left of the podcast title. You will also notice a settings icon at the top of each podcast. You will find a settings tab for sorting episodes and changing the status for subscribed and notifications. Under the section On This iPhone, you will set how often you want to refresh podcasts, limit the number of episodes you want to appear in the Unplayed section, download the most recent episode, or you can choose to turn on the option to delete episodes after 24 hours. Well, that's it for this episode. I'm Tim Brown. You can check me out at myapplepodcast.com. You can also find me on youtube.com/myapplepodcast. See you next time.